A legend vanishes. On the sweltering afternoon of July 30th, 1975, one of the most powerful men in America stepped into the parking lot of a Detroit suburb restaurant and vanished without a trace. Jimmy Hoffa, the iron-fisted former president of the Teamsters Union, a man who had risen from poverty to command one of the most influential labor organizations in the nation, was suddenly gone. The car he drove was found abandoned, his lunch appointment missed, and his name splashed across every newspaper headline the next morning. Yet in the nearly 50 years since that day, no body, no conclusive evidence, and no definitive answers have ever emerged. For many Americans, Hoffa was not just a union boss. He was a living legend, a symbol of working-class power, corruption, and ambition. His disappearance was not a quiet fade into history, but an explosion that rocked the foundations of labor, politics, and organized crime. The man who had fought presidents, negotiated with mob bosses, and bent industries to his will had been erased overnight. And in his absence, speculation flourished. Was he murdered by the Mafia he once worked with? Was he silenced by political enemies? Or did he vanish into some witness protection program, his death faked as part of a hidden bargain? According to official FBI records, Hoffa was last seen outside the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. He had gone there expecting a meeting with two mobsters, Anthony Provenzano, a notoriously violent New Jersey Teamster leader with deep Mafia ties, and Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mobster. But neither man ever arrived, and Hoffa, impatient and angry, reportedly called home to complain. That was the last time his voice was heard. In the years since, Hoffa's disappearance has grown into one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. It is a story told not only in police files but in whispers from smoky back rooms, in Mafia lore, in courtroom testimonies, and in Hollywood films. To many, his vanishing act is more than a crime is the ultimate symbol of the Mafia's reach and the government's impotence. The truth is buried, perhaps literally, beneath decades of lies, corruption, and silence. But what is certain is this: Jimmy Hoffa's fate was sealed long before that July afternoon. His life, his rise, and his many enemies all converged on that moment in the Red Fox parking lot. To understand why Hoffa disappeared, we must first understand who he was, a man both revered and feared, who clawed his way to power with charisma, ruthlessness, and alliances that would eventually destroy him. Thus begins our journey into Hoffa's world. In Block 2, we will trace his early years, from a poor boy in Indiana to a union organizer in Detroit, laying the foundations for the empire and the enemies that would define his life and his death. The rise of Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa's story begins far from the smoke-filled union halls and Mafia-controlled boardrooms of the mid-20th century. Born in 1913 in Brazil, Indiana, Hoffa grew up in a working-class family during the lean years of the Great Depression. His father, a coal miner, died when Jimmy was still young, leaving his mother to raise the family in a world where labor meant survival. From the beginning, Hoffa understood hardship and he developed an unshakable determination to rise above it. As a teenager, Hoffa quit school to support his family. He took jobs in warehouses and loading docks, places where men broke their backs for pennies and employers exploited every weakness. It was here that Hoffa first learned the power of solidarity. When he organized fellow workers to resist unfair conditions, he discovered not only his natural charisma, but also his lifelong mission: to unite working men against those who sought to use them as disposable tools. By the age of 20, Hoffa had become involved with the Teamsters, a union that represented truck drivers and warehouse laborers. At the time, the Teamsters were a relatively modest organization, plagued by internal strife and external threats. But Hoffa saw potential. He had the gift of persuasion, the ability to look a man in the eye and make him feel that together they could take on the world. This talent propelled him through the ranks at an astonishing pace. Hoffa's rise coincided with America's industrial boom. Trucks were the arteries of commerce, carrying goods across a rapidly expanding nation. Whoever controlled the drivers controlled the flow of commerce itself. Hoffa understood this better than most, and he threw himself into organizing efforts with relentless energy. He was willing to stand on picket lines, endure beatings, and negotiate face-to-face with hostile bosses. Workers saw in him not just a leader, but one of their own. By the early 1940s, Hoffa's reputation was established. He had become a regional organizer of considerable influence, feared by employers and admired by rank-and-file members. His methods were sometimes ruthless, was not above intimidation, threats, or backroom deals, but his results were undeniable. Under his leadership, wages rose, benefits expanded, and the Teamsters grew in strength and numbers. This period also marked Hoffa's first real brush with organized crime. In order to protect strikes, intimidate scabs, and expand union influence, Hoffa occasionally turned to local mobsters. It was a marriage of convenience labor needed muscle, and the Mafia was happy to provide it for a price. These early connections would one day grow into the alliances that fueled his empire and sealed his fate. According to contemporaries, Hoffa worked tirelessly, often sleeping only a few hours a night. His ambition was boundless, his appetite for power insatiable. By the end of World War II, the young man from Indiana was no longer just another organizer, was a force of nature. The stage was set for his meteoric rise to the presidency of the Teamsters Union, and with it, the beginning of his complicated dance with power, politics, and the underworld. Thus, Block 2 closes with Hoffa on the cusp of greatness. In Block 3, we will witness how he transformed the Teamsters into a vast empire, one that would dominate American labor and place him at the center of wealth, politics, and criminal intrigue. The Teamsters Union Empire. By the mid-1940s, Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just an organizer with a rising titan within the labor movement. As America's economy boomed after World War II, the demand for trucking soared. Goods, raw materials, and finished products needed to be moved across the vast geography of the United States, and the men behind the wheels of those trucks were represented by the Teamsters. Hoffa recognized a simple but profound truth. Whoever controlled the truck drivers controlled the flow of commerce itself. Under Hoffa's influence, the Teamsters Union grew at an unprecedented pace. Membership exploded, eventually surpassing 2 million workers, making it the largest labor union in America. With numbers came power, political, economic, and social. Hoffa wielded this power with both cunning and ferocity. He knew how to negotiate contracts that improved wages and benefits, but he also understood how to leverage strikes to bring entire industries to a standstill. Employers knew that crossing Hoffa could mean financial ruin. But Hoffa was more than just a labor leader. He was a strategist. He consolidated union locals, centralized authority, and built an organizational machine that was as disciplined as it was intimidating. He was adored by many of his members, who saw their quality of life improve dramatically under his leadership. To the rank-and-file Teamsters, Hoffa was their champion, a man who stood shoulder to shoulder with them against corporations and political elites. At the same time, Hoffa's methods were far from clean. His reliance on mob connections deepened during this period. The Mafia provided muscle to enforce strikes and intimidate rivals, while Hoffa provided access to the Teamsters' enormous pension fund. Billions of dollars in union assets became a slush fund for organized crime, financing casinos in Las Vegas and investments across the country. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement until loyalties began to fray. Hoffa's influence soon reached Washington, D.C. Politicians courted his support, knowing the Teamsters' voting power could sway elections. He met with senators, congressmen, and even presidents, presenting himself as the voice of the American working man. Yet behind closed doors, Hoffa was feared as much as he was respected. His reputation for ruthlessness preceded him, and rumors of bribery, embezzlement, and mob ties followed wherever he went. Despite the controversies, Hoffa achieved what few labor leaders ever could. He transformed the Teamsters into an empire. Under his stewardship, the union was not only a defender of workers' rights, but also a shadow power broker that touched every corner of American life. Truck drivers, warehousemen, freight haulers all operated under the Teamsters' expanding umbrella, and Hoffa sat at its peak like a king. According to contemporaries, Hoffa's authority was absolute. His word could launch a nationwide strike or secure a favorable contract in hours. But absolute power comes with absolute risk. Hoffa's growing ties to the underworld, combined with his unchecked influence, began to draw the attention of powerful enemies, not only the Mafia, but the federal government itself. Thus, Block 3 closes with Hoffa at the height of his empire. In Block 4, we will explore the dangerous dance between Hoffa and the Mafia alliances built on necessity, but destined to collapse in betrayal and blood. Hoffa and the Mafia connection. The Teamsters Union, under Jimmy Hoffa's command, became not only the most powerful labor organization in America, but also a financial giant. At the center of this empire lay the Teamsters Pension Fund, a vast pool of billions of dollars meant to secure the retirement of hardworking truckers. But in the shadowy world of mid-20th century America, those funds became the lifeblood of organized crime. Hoffa's alliance with the Mafia was not born of friendship but necessity. Strikes needed protection, and rivals needed intimidation. From Detroit to Chicago, from New York to Las Vegas, mob families provided the muscle while Hoffa provided access to money. It was a symbiotic relationship. The Mafia ensured Hoffa's dominance within the labor movement, and in return, they gained access to loans from the Teamsters Pension Fund, often with little expectation of repayment. This relationship fueled the growth of Las Vegas. Teamsters' money built casinos, hotels, and entertainment palaces, turning the desert into a neon empire. Behind the glitz of the Strip lay a darker truth. Union members' retirement savings were being funneled into mob control projects. Profits enriched crime bosses, while Hoffa secured loyalty and influence across the underworld. But the Mafia's embrace came with a cost. Hoffa's dealings tied him to dangerous Tony Provenzano of New Jersey, Santo Trafficani of Florida, and a Chicago outfit, among others. These were not allies to be trusted, but predators who saw Hoffa as useful so long as he served their interests. Hoffa, ever ambitious, believed he could control them, just as he controlled his union. Yet in reality, every dollar borrowed, every favor granted, tightened the Mafia's grip on him. Government investigators soon took notice. Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General in the early 1960s, launched an all-out war on Hoffa. Kennedy saw him as the embodiment of corruption, a labor leader who had sold out his members to organized crime. The hearings were dramatic. Hoffa, combative and defiant, clashed publicly with Kennedy, turning their feud into one of the most bitter in American political history. But while Kennedy exposed the Mafia connection, proving it in court remained elusive. According to FBI files, Hoffa's network of mob ties extended across nearly every major American city. Wiretaps, informants, and surveillance all pointed to the same reality. Hoffa had built his empire on an uneasy pact with the Mafia. The pension fund was their shared currency, and Hoffa was both its guardian and its exploiter. The irony was Scharf was beloved by his members for delivering higher wages and better benefits, even as their savings funded organized crime. But Hoffa's overconfidence was dangerous. He believed that his influence over both the union and the mob was unshakable. In truth, he was walking a tightrope, balancing labor, politics, and organized crime in a game where one misstep could be fatal. Thus, Block 4 closes with Hoffa at the peak of his dangerous alliance. In Block 5, we will see how this precarious relationship and the government's relentless pursuit finally brought Hoffa crashing down, sending him to prison and setting the stage for the betrayals that would follow. The downfall prison years. By the mid-1960s, Jimmy Hoffa was a man under siege. His unchecked power within the Teamsters and his brazen ties to organized crime had placed him squarely in the crosshairs of the federal government. At the forefront of this crusade was Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who saw Hoffa as the embodiment of corruption in American labor. The feud between the two men was not only political, it was deeply personal. Kennedy had made it his mission to bring Hoffa down, and he pursued him with relentless vigor. In 1964, Hoffa's enemies finally succeeded. After years of investigations, trials, and hung juries, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering, attempted bribery, and fraud. The charges stem from his attempts to manipulate union pension funds and to buy influence in courtrooms. Though Hoffa protested his innocence with his trademark defiance, the verdict was clear. He was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. The fall was dramatic. From commanding one of the largest labor unions in the world, Hoffa was now reduced to a prisoner behind bars. In 1967, he entered the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, a far cry from the smoky union halls and backroom meetings that had once defined his life. Inside prison, Hoffa struggled to adjust. His fiery temper and need for control clashed with the rigid structure of incarceration. Yet even behind bars, Hoffa sought to wield influence, building networks among inmates and attempting to maintain contact with allies on the outside. But prison also reshaped Hoffa's position within the Teamsters. His absence created a power vacuum, one that was quickly filled by Frank Fitzsimmons, a man Hoffa had once trusted, but who proved far more pliable to Mafia influence. While Hoffa languished in prison, Fitzsimmons expanded his ties to organized crime and became the Teamsters' official leader. The pension fund remained a Mafia piggy bank, but Hoffa was no longer the gatekeeper. The years in prison took a toll. Hoffa's health declined, and his once-iron grip on the union weakened. Yet he never stopped plotting his return. Letters, visitors, and secret messages carried his ambitions to the outside world. He believed that once he was free, he could reclaim the throne he had lost and restore the Union to his command. But this ambition, his refusal to fade quietly into history, would become the very reason the Mafia turned against him. According to accounts from prison officials and fellow inmates, Hoffa never abandoned his swagger. He remained defiant, mocking the government and vowing revenge on those who had betrayed him. But time was not on his side. Every year behind bars eroded his authority, and every move made by Fitzsimmons and the Mafia further distanced Hoffa from the union he once ruled. Thus, Block 5 closes with Hoffa in prison, diminished but unbroken. In Block 6, we will examine the moment he was granted an unexpected lifeline, a presidential pardon from Richard Nixon, a decision that would reignite Hoffa's ambitions and seal his fate. Nixon's pardon and return attempt. By the early 1970s, Jimmy Hoffa's prison sentence appeared destined to define the rest of his life. But in 1971, a stunning development shifted the course of his fate. President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence, allowing him to walk free after serving just 5 years of his 13-year term. Officially, the pardon was a gesture toward leniency, but many suspected backroom deals and Mafia influence played a crucial role. The conditions of Nixon's clemency included one major stipulation: Hoffa was barred from engaging in union activities until 1980. For most men, this would have been a clear signal to retire quietly, to fade into obscurity. But Hoffa was not most men. His ambition, his pride, and his obsession with regaining control of the Teamsters burned hotter than ever. From the moment he left prison, Hoffa set his sights on reclaiming his throne. Yet the world outside had changed. In his absence, Frank Fitzsimmons had tightened his grip on the Teamsters leadership, enjoying Mafia backing and government tolerance. Fitzsimmons was far more cooperative with organized crime, allowing mob bosses freer access to the union's pension funds. For the Mafia, Fitzsimmons was the perfect puppet, pliable, obedient, and profitable. Hoffa's return threatened all of that. Hoffa began traveling, reconnecting with allies, and building support among Teamster locals who still revered him as their champion. He gave fiery speeches, granted interviews, and publicly declared his intent to run for leadership once again. To the Mafia, this was nothing short of betrayal. They had worked hard to secure Fitzsimmons, and they had no interest in allowing Hoffa back into power. Tensions mounted. Reports surfaced of Hoffa clashing with Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters boss and mob figure with whom Hoffa had once been close. Their relationship had soured in prison, devolving into hostility and threats. By the mid-1970s, their feud was an open secret. Hoffa's return campaign placed him directly in conflict not only with Provenzano, but with the broader interests of the Mafia Commission itself. According to FBI surveillance, Hoffa was warned multiple times to back down, to accept retirement and avoid further conflict. But Hoffa, true to his nature, refused. He believed he could strong-arm his way back into control, just as he always had. What Hoffa failed to recognize or perhaps refused to admit was that the Mafia no longer needed him. Worse, they now saw him as a liability, a man whose arrogance could jeopardize their empire. Thus, Block 6 closes with Hoffa free from prison, but ensnared in a dangerous web of ambition and betrayal. In Block 7, we will see how Hoffa's defiance pushed the Mafia's patience to its limits and why men like Tony Provenzano decided that Jimmy Hoffa had to be permanently removed from the picture. The Mafia's growing unease. By 1973, Jimmy Hoffa's determination to reclaim his place atop the Teamsters Union had become impossible to ignore. His public statements, private meetings, and bold appearances in the press all carried one message: Jimmy was coming back. To his loyalists, it was a rallying cry. To the Mafia, it was a threat that could not be tolerated. The Mafia had grown comfortable under Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's successor. Fitzsimmons was cooperative and predictable, granting mob bosses easy access to the Teamsters' massive pension fund. They funneled millions into casino developments, construction projects, and other ventures that strengthened their empire. With Fitzsimmons in charge, everyone in the underworld prospered. But Hoffa's return risked destabilizing this delicate balance. Hoffa had never been a puppet. He was a man who demanded control, not compromise. The first major sign of Mafia hostility came from Tony Provenzano, as Tony Prow, once close ally of Hoffa. The two had shared prison time, but their relationship soured over disputes and power struggles. By the mid-1970s, their rivalry had turned toxic. Provenzano was a powerful figure in the Genovese crime family, and his feud with Hoffa escalated into open threats. Witnesses later recounted Hoffa receiving messages that made it clear if he did not step aside, violence would follow. But Provenzano was not Hoffa's only problem. The commission, a governing body of the American Mafia, was increasingly wary of his ambitions. Hoffa's constant maneuvering threatened to draw unwanted federal attention back to the Teamsters, just as mob bosses were enjoying a period of relative peace and prosperity. To them, Hoffa was not a valuable partner anymore, but a dangerous liability. FBI surveillance at the time captured snippets of mob conversations, suggesting that discussions about Hoffa's fate were taking place at the highest levels. Agents believed that several Mafia families had reached a rare consensus. Hoffa needed to be silenced. Still, Hoffa ignored the warnings. He believed his history with the mob, his connections, and his sheer force of what would protect him. In truth, his defiance only sealed his fate. According to accounts from Hoffa's confidants, he became increasingly paranoid during this period. He suspected betrayal from within his own circle, worried about wiretaps, and carried himself with the air of a man at war. Yet he never backed down. Hoffa continued to make calls, set meetings, and demand the respect he felt was owed to him. In his mind, he was irreplaceable. To the Mafia, however, he had already been replaced. Thus, Block 7 closes with a storm gathering on the horizon. Hoffa's ambition and defiance had brought him into direct conflict with men who never issued empty threats. In Block 8, we will turn to the fateful day itself, July 30, 1975, when Hoffa stepped into a suburban Detroit parking lot for what he believed was a meeting and walked into history's greatest mystery. July 30th, 1975, the final day. The morning of July 30th, 1975, began like any other for Jimmy Hoffa. He ate breakfast at his modest lakeside home in Lake Orion, Michigan, and spoke with his wife, Josephine. To her, Hoffa seemed restless but determined, focused on the day ahead. He had an important lunch meeting scheduled, one that he believed could finally clear the way for his return to power in the Teamsters Union. Shortly after 1 p.m., Hoffa left his home, driving his green Pontiac Granville. He was dressed sharply, as always, a white short-sleeved shirt, dark trousers, and his signature thick-rimmed glasses. At 2 p.m., he arrived at the Machu's Red Fox restaurant, located in Bloomfield Township, a suburb of Detroit. The restaurant was a popular spot for businessmen and mobsters alike, sitting near the intersection of Telegraph and Maple Roads. According to FBI records, Hoffa was supposed to meet Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mobster, and Anthony Provenzano, the New Jersey Teamster boss and longtime rival. The purpose of the meeting, Hoffa believed, was to resolve disputes and negotiate his return to power. But from the beginning, things seemed off. Neither Giacalone nor Provenzano showed up at the appointed time. Witnesses later recalled seeing Hoffa pacing outside the restaurant, visibly irritated. At around 2:15 p.m., he used a payphone to call his wife, telling her he had been stood up and complaining that he was tired of waiting. It was the last confirmed contact anyone had with him. By 3 p.m., Hoffa was seen getting into a car in the restaurant parking lot. The vehicle was reportedly a maroon Mercury Marquis, and inside were 3 men, 2 of whom Hoffa allegedly recognized. Who those men were remains a matter of dispute, but many investigators believe they were mob associates sent to lure Hoffa to his death. After entering that car, Hoffa was never seen again. That evening, Hoffa failed to return home. His wife grew worried, making calls to friends and associates. By nightfall, panic had set in. The following morning, Hoffa's green Pontiac was discovered in the restaurant parking lot, locked and empty. There were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints of value, no blood. The man who had once controlled America's largest labor union had vanished, as if into thin air. According to the FBI, the timing and precision of the disappearance suggested a professional hit. There were no mistakes, no loose ends, and no trace left behind. 4 seasoned investigators, it bore all the hallmarks of a mafia operation. But without a body, the case would prove maddeningly elusive. Thus, Block 8 closes with Hoffa stepping into the unknown. In Block 9, we will follow the immediate aftermath. The frantic search, the FBI's early theories, and the dawning realization that Hoffa's disappearance was not a misunderstanding, but a crime that would shake the nation. Immediate aftermath. When Jimmy Hoffa failed to return home on the evening of July 30th, 1975, alarm bells rang almost immediately. For decades, Hoffa had lived in a world of constant danger threats from rivals, scrutiny from the government, and tensions with the Mafia. His family knew that disappearing without a word was unthinkable. His wife, Josephine, began calling friends and associates, desperate for news. By late evening, her worry had grown into panic. Hoffa's absence was no accident. The following morning, Hoffa's green Pontiac Granville was discovered still parked outside the Machu's Red Fox restaurant. The car was locked, and there were no immediate signs of foul play. No broken glass, no struggle, no blood. It looked as if the man had simply vanished into the air. But investigators knew better. The precision suggested a carefully orchestrated disappearance, likely carried out by professionals. By July 31st, the FBI was officially involved. Agents descended on the restaurant, canvassing the area for witnesses. Employees and customers recalled seeing Hoffa pacing in the parking lot and making a phone call around 2:15 p.m. A few even reported spotting him getting into a car, though details about the vehicle and its occupants varied. These conflicting accounts would frustrate investigators for years. Hoffa's family held out hope in those early hours. Perhaps he had been kidnapped for ransom, they thought. But no ransom demand ever came. Instead, silence reigned. For Josephine and their children, it was the beginning of a nightmare and gnawing uncertainty that would never truly end. The Teamsters Union was thrown into chaos. Rumors swirled. Some whispered that Hoffa had gone into hiding, others that he had been taken out by the Mafia. Fitzsimmons, now firmly entrenched as the union's leader, remained notably quiet, offering little more than obligatory concern. To many of Hoffa's loyalists, the silence was deafening. For law enforcement, the urgency was clear. Hoffa was no ordinary citizen. His disappearance carried enormous implications not only for labor, but for organized crime and politics alike. If the Mafia had indeed killed him, it was a bold act of defiance against federal pressure. If not, the mystery pointed to an even deeper conspiracy. According to early FBI reports, every lead seemed to dissolve into shadows. The car Hoffa allegedly entered was never found. Witness descriptions contradicted one another. Informants within the Mafia offered only silence or misleading stories. And without a body, there was no crime scene to dissect only a void where a man once stood. Thus, Block 9 closes with the chilling uncertainty of those first days. In Block 10, we will explore the FBI's full-scale investigation. The wiretaps, the raids, and the desperate search for answers in America's most infamous disappearance. FBI investigation begins. As the days stretched into weeks, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance evolved from a local mystery into a national obsession. The FBI, already well aware of Hoffa's tangled history with organized crime, mobilized one of the most intensive investigations in its history. Agents believed from the outset that Hoffa had been the victim of a Mafia hit. The question was not if foul play occurred, but who had ordered it and why. The first wave of the investigation focused on the Machu's Red Fox restaurant. Forensic teams scoured the parking lot, searching for any trace evidence. They examined Hoffa's abandoned Pontiac, but found nothing of Valueno fingerprints, no blood, no fibers. It was as if the scene had been sterilized. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly, but their accounts contradicted one another, adding to the confusion. Some claimed to have seen Hoffa in the restaurant lobby. Others swore he never entered the building at all. Attention quickly turned to Hoffa's supposed lunch companions Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone. Both denied ever agreeing to meet Hoffa that day, and both produced alibis that, though flimsy, were never definitively disproven. Still, investigators believed the two men were central to the plot. The problem was proving it. The Mafia operated under a code of silence, and without a cooperating witness, the case was little more than suspicion. The FBI launched a series of raids across Detroit, targeting mob hangouts, warehouses, and even secluded farmhouses. Dozens of suspects were dragged in for questioning, but none cracked under pressure. Wiretaps were deployed on phones connected to the Giacalone and Provenzano families, yielding colorful conversations but nothing conclusive about Hoffa's fate. One agent later remarked that the mobsters were too disciplined. They joked about Hoffa's disappearance, but never admitted to involvement. At the national level, the case drew enormous political attention. Congress demanded answers, and the public, fascinated by Hoffa's larger-than-life persona, followed every twist and turn. Speculation filled newspapers and television broadcasts. Was Hoffa buried beneath a freeway? Dumped in the Great Lakes? Burned in a Detroit crematorium? Each theory was explored, leaked, and then abandoned as evidence failed to materialize. The FBI's frustration grew. Despite expending thousands of man-hours, they could not even classify the case as a homicide without a body. For the Bureau, it was a bitter pill. They knew Hoffa was dead, but they could not prove it. And for the Mafia, that was the perfect outcome of a disappearance, so clean that even the nation's top law enforcement agency was left chasing shadows. Thus, Block 10 closes with the FBI's massive but fruitless investigation. In Block 11, we will examine the Mafia's silence, the unbroken code of omerta that kept Hoffa's killers safe and ensured that the truth of July 30th, 1975 would remain hidden for generations. Mafia's silence. If the FBI's investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance proved anything, it was this: the Mafia's code of silence omerta is unbreakable. No matter how much pressure agents applied, no matter how many subpoenas were issued, no one within organized crime circles spoke openly about Hoffa's fate. The silence was total, and it was chilling. From the beginning, federal agents suspected that Hoffa's disappearance had been sanctioned at the highest levels of the Mafia Commission. Theories circulated that bosses from New York, Chicago, and Detroit had all agreed that Hoffa had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, to be allowed to reclaim power within the Teamsters. Yet despite decades of investigation, no Mafia boss was ever charged in connection with his disappearance. The silence held firm. Informants provided hints, but never proof. Some whispered that Hoffa had been lured to his death by people he trusted. Others suggested he was taken to a secluded location, murdered swiftly, and his body destroyed to eliminate all evidence. One rumor spoke of a Detroit crematorium, where Hoffa's remains were allegedly incinerated within hours of his abduction. Another suggested his body was buried at a mob-owned farm or encased in concrete under a building project. The stories varied, but the one constant was that no insider ever broke omerta to confirm the truth. The FBI tried every tactic: wiretaps, surveillance, infiltration, but organized crime families closed ranks. Even men who later became informants on other matters refused to speak about Hoffa. It was as if his disappearance had been elevated beyond a simple hit, transformed into a sacred secret of the underworld. For Hoffa's family, the silence was agonizing. His wife Josephine and their children pressed for answers, but doors remained closed. The Mafia's refusal to speak robbed them not only of justice, but of closure. Every rumor that surfaced reopened wounds, each new theory reminding them of the cruel fact that Hoffa had vanished without a trace. Even decades later, retired mobsters interviewed by journalists often danced around the subject. Some hinted they knew what had happened. Others laughed off the speculation, but none offered verifiable details. For law enforcement, it was the ultimate frustration. Everyone knew the Mafia had killed Hoffa, but no one could prove it. Thus, Block 11 closes with a portrait of silence more powerful than violence. The Mafia's refusal to break omerta ensured that Hoffa's killers walked free and that the mystery endured. In Block 12, we will explore the countless theories of Hoffa's murder and alleged burial sites, the whispered confessions, and the competing narratives that have kept America guessing for nearly half a century. Theories and alleged burial sites. As years turned into decades, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance gave rise to a labyrinth of theories, each more chilling than the last. With no body and no definitive evidence, speculation filled the void, transforming Hoffa's fate into one of America's most enduring mysteries. One of the earliest theories suggested that Hoffa had been buried beneath Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. The stadium, which opened in 1976, was rumored to have been built with mob-connected labor and financing. For years, whispers claimed that Hoffa's body was encased in concrete under the end zone. When the stadium was demolished in 2010, nothing was found, but the legend of the Hoffa under the field persisted in popular culture. Another theory pointed closer to home. Some investigators believed Hoffa had been murdered in Detroit, his body transported to a mob-controlled farm in Milford Township, Michigan. Searches of the property in the late 1970s yielded no results, though informants swore the farm was Hoffa's final resting place. Others claimed he had been cremated in a Detroit funeral home, his remains reduced to ash within hours of his abduction. This theory appealed to many experts as it explained the total lack of evidence. Still others suggested Hoffa's body had been dismembered and disposed of in the Great Lakes. The idea of Hoffa's remains lying at the bottom of Lake Michigan or Lake Erie captured the imagination, though divers and sonar sweeps found nothing. The theory underscored the scale of Mafia power at the time, the ability to make a man vanish as if he had never existed. In 2012, new interest was sparked when the FBI searched a property in Roseville, Michigan, based on tips from alleged mob associates. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies, but no body was found. Once again, hope gave way to disappointment. Every theory carried the same haunting truth. None could be proved. The Mafia's meticulous planning ensured that even if Hoffa's killers were long dead, the secret of his burial site remained intact. For investigators, each failed dig was a reminder of the limits of justice. For the public, each theory kept Hoffa's ghost alive in the American imagination. Thus, Block 12 closes with an array of unanswered questions. In Block 13, we will examine the supposed confessions of mobsters who, in their final years, hinted at knowing the truth but never fully revealed it. Confessions and deathbed revelations. As the decades passed, and the men who once ruled America's underworld aged, whispers of the truth about Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance began to surface. Confessions often made in the twilight of life offered tantalizing glimpses into what might have happened, but none ever delivered conclusive proof. One of the most notorious claims came from Frank Sheeran, a Union official and mob enforcer. In his 2004 memoir, I Heard You Paint Houses, Sheeran confessed to being the man who killed Hoffa. According to his account, Hoffa had been lured to a Detroit house under the guise of a meeting, where Sheeran shot him twice in the back of the head. Sheeran claimed the body was then cremated. His story gained traction, especially after Martin Scorsese's 2019 film The Irishman dramatized it, but forensic tests on the house identified by Sheeran revealed no physical evidence. Other alleged confessions came from mob figures like Tony Zerilli, a Detroit underboss, who in 2013 claimed Hoffa had been buried in a shallow grave near a Detroit farmhouse. The FBI investigated the claim, even conducting digs, but again found nothing. Zerilli insisted Hoffa's death had been ordered by the highest levels of the Mafia Commission, with his body disposed of to prevent discovery. Richard the Weasel Kuklinski, a notorious hitman, also claimed involvement, stating in interviews that he had been part of the crew that killed Hoffa. Yet Kuklinski's penchant for exaggeration cast doubt on his claims, and no corroborating evidence was ever found. Even lesser-known mobsters occasionally hinted at knowledge. Some suggested Hoffa had been strangled, others that he had been shot, and still others that he was beaten to death. The methods differed, but the narrative remained the same. Hoffa had been betrayed by men he trusted, executed swiftly, and erased without a trace. For investigators, these confessions were both valuable and frustrating. They kept the case alive, fueling public interest and generating leads, but they never provided the closure needed. Without a body, without physical proof, each deathbed revelation was little more than another story in the growing legend. Thus, Block 13 closes with the haunting sense that the truth lies buried within the half-spoken words of dying men. In Block 14, we will turn to the cultural impact of Hoffa's disappearance, the books, films, and myths that have ensured his story will never be forgotten. Cultural impact and myth-making. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance transcended the boundaries of crime reporting and law enforcement, entering the realm of legend. By the 1980s, Hoffa had become less a man than a symbol, the embodiment of corruption, ambition, and mystery in American life. His vanishing act was unlike any other. It left behind no body, no evidence, only speculation. That vacuum was quickly filled with myth-making. Books poured onto shelves, each offering a different theory or interpretation. Journalists, former mobsters, and law enforcement officials all published their own accounts, each one promising the real story. Yet no two aligned. This inconsistency only fueled public fascination. The story of Hoffa became a kind of Rorschach test. People saw in it what they wanted to believe about power, crime, and America itself. Hollywood, too, seized upon Hoffa's mystique. Jack Nicholson portrayed him in the 1992 film Hoffa, a larger-than-life depiction that blended fact and fiction. Decades later, Martin Scorsese reignited debate with The Irishman, dramatizing Frank Sheeran's controversial confession. Each retelling reached millions, ensuring that Hoffa's story endured not just as history, but as entertainment. Theories of Hoffa's burial became cultural memes. Comedians joked about him being under Giant Stadium, and references to Hoffa appeared in television shows, cartoons, and even children's programming. His name became shorthand for something lost forever, hidden just out of reach. For Americans, Hoffa was no longer just a labor leader, was folklore. Academics also weighed in, treating Hoffa's disappearance as a lens through which to study labor history, organized crime, and American politics. His story was taught in classrooms, dissected in documentaries, and cited in works of sociology. Hoffa became both a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition and a case study in the enduring reach of the Mafia. But perhaps the most haunting cultural impact was the one felt by ordinary Americans. For union workers, Hoffa was still remembered as the man who had fought for better wages and conditions, even as his corruption was exposed. For others, his fate symbolized the fragility of power, the idea that even the most powerful man could vanish without a trace. Thus, Block 14 closes with Hoffa as a figure of myth as much as reality. In Block 15, we will confront the legacy of his disappearance, the lessons it left behind, the unresolved questions that remain, and the enduring sense that Hoffa's ghost still lingers in America's consciousness. Legacy and unanswered questions. Nearly half a century after Jimmy Hoffa vanished, his story remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. His disappearance is not just a tale of crime, but a meditation on power, loyalty, and betrayal. To this day, Hoffa's name conjures images of smoky union halls, mafia backrooms, and the shadowy intersection of labor and organized crime. For historians, Hoffa's legacy is paradoxical. On one hand, he was a champion of the working man, securing wages, benefits, and dignity for millions of truck drivers. On the other, he was a man whose alliances with organized crime tainted the very cause he claimed to serve. The Teamsters under Hoffa became a powerhouse, but the cost of entangling themselves with mob bosses who saw the union as a personal bank. For law enforcement, Hoffa's disappearance was both a failure and a lesson. Despite decades of effort, the FBI never solved the case. The Mafia's code of silence held, and the perfect crime remained perfect. Yet the investigation reshaped federal strategies against organized crime, leading to stronger racketeering laws and more aggressive prosecution of mob families. In this way, Hoffa's death indirectly weakened the Mafia he once courted. For the American public, Hoffa became a ghost that refused to fade. His story has been retold in books, films, and television shows, each new version offering another possible answer, but never the truth. His fate has inspired countless theories, from the plausible to the absurd, cementing his place in the pantheon of American folklore. Perhaps the greatest unanswered question is not where Hoffa's body lies, but why the truth has never been revealed. Was it fear that silenced those who knew, or was it respect for the Mafia's code? Even as mob influence declined, the secret of Hoffa's fate endured passed down, perhaps, as a dark inheritance within the underworld. What remains certain is that Hoffa's disappearance altered the landscape of American labor and crime forever. He is remembered as both hero and villain, victim and perpetrator, king and ghost. His story reminds us that power, no matter how great, can vanish in an instant, leaving only questions where answers should be. Thus, Block 15 closes with Hoffa's enduring legacy, a mystery without resolution, a life that ended not with clarity, but with silence. And as long as the truth remains buried, Jimmy Hoffa will continue to haunt America not only as a man who disappeared, but as a symbol of the secrets this nation may never uncover.